Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, dear brothers and sisters from all around the world, in a new episode of Signs of Prophethood. This is your host, Omar Khalid. We're going to talk in this episode about the acceptance of the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ as a sign that he was sent by Allah to all nations. We're going to talk in details of some of the incidences and also about the previous messengers and how they prayed to Allah and Allah also accepted their prayer. But before this, we would like to welcome Sheikh Ibrahim. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Ibrahim. Very happy to see you again, Sheikh Ibrahim. Thank you. So, as the beginning of this, we would like to know the importance of knowing about the life of the Prophet ﷺ and in details about the incidences that he asked Allah for things and Allah answered his prayer.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. The Prophet ﷺ, being the best of all the Prophets of Allah, the seal of all of the Prophets, the best of all mankind, his dua, supplication, was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted all of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, and every messenger of Allah, he would have a da'wah or a dua for his ummah. And the same thing for the Prophet ﷺ. But the specific dua, the many situations where the Prophet ﷺ would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept his dua. And that's why when we look into the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and his seerah, many incidences to individual companions of the Prophet ﷺ, many things when he was with his companions in the battlefield and he would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. The Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perfected him with the ibadah. And the dua is the ibadah, as the Prophet ﷺ said. The dua of asking and the dua of praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ taught us the best dua ever. The speech of the Prophet ﷺ in his dua, the most comprehensive one, and the sincerity and the truthfulness of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ was all means for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept his dua. And in many cases in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, as I said, to individuals, to situations where the Prophet ﷺ faced, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him victory and aided him in every step that he took, alayhi salatu wassalam.
So what about, Sheikh Ibrahim, like that we hear that every prophet and messenger of Allah, he has one prayer that he can pray. Is it in general or is it just for his nation?
No.
What is it?
This is for the Prophet's nation. So every messenger of Allah, he had a da'wah, a dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept for his nation, whether it's for or against them. So like Nuh alayhi salam, he made dua against his people after giving them da'wah for 950 years. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the flood on them and they were all drowned. Musa alayhi salam made dua against Fir'aun and his people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroyed them and so on. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he kept the acceptance of his dua to be in the hereafter. And that's why this is the last nation and the most of all nations when it comes to the Jannah and entering the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it will be shafa'ah from the Prophet ﷺ to his ummah, intercession. The Prophet ﷺ will intercede for his ummah in the Day of Judgment, and he would reach the highest level in the Day of Judgment, and the ummah will be blessed by this intercession that no other nation would seek or would have these blessings like the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ.
So we can differentiate between that there is one prayer for each messenger, and in general, the messengers of Allah, if they pray to Allah, their prayer is accepted. But is it for in every incident that they pray, or if some exceptions they can pray and Allah doesn't accept this prayer?
No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept their prayers. And the messengers of Allah, they are the most knowledgeable about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why when we look into, when people lack the knowledge, their dua becomes, accordingly, out of ignorance. Sometimes a person would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah give him $1 million, or this specific car, or that specific thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can accept the dua of a person like this, but is that really what is benefiting? And the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophets of Allah, their dua was for what is benefiting, understanding perfectly the purpose of their life, and mainly matters of the deen. When you see their dua is for the benefit of the deen, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aid the deen, and that by itself is an evidence of the prophethood, that their message is to be fulfilled perfectly. So they would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the message is fulfilled the way they made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to give them victory, to establish the message. And that by itself is a clear evidence of the prophethood. And also to individuals, like the Prophet ﷺ, for example, when he made dua for Anas radiallahu anh, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless his wealth and his children. And after the Prophet ﷺ, Anas radiallahu anh lived for a long life, that he said, I buried with my own hand 60 of my children.
Subhanallah.
That's the ones that died during his lifetime. You know, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with so much wealth
Subhanallah.
as a result of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ. There are individuals dua like this, like the Prophet ﷺ making dua to Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu to memorize the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ when he said to him, "Ibsut spread your sheet, and whatever the Prophet ﷺ said, he collected it, it would never be lost." And he used to be very strong in memorizing the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, making dua to Abdullah ibn Abbas, his cousin, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would increase his knowledge and make him comprehend the tafsir of the Quran. Abdullah ibn Abbas was a boy. The Prophet ﷺ died, and Abdullah ibn Abbas was almost in the age of puberty. And the Prophet ﷺ would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for him. Allahumma faqihu fi din wa alimu ta'wil. Allah make him comprehend the religion, and specifically teach him how to make the ta'wil, tafsir of the Quran. Very amazing how the da'wah is. And open any book of tafsir. Almost every verse in the Quran, you would find a statement by Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu explaining the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, even though the Prophet ﷺ died when he was still a young boy. And many things like this, whether it's materialistic matters or whether it's religious matters, the Prophet ﷺ's dua was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
So mentioning Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, there's a beautiful story we'd like to know about, and in the end of it, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he prayed for somebody in this story. We'd like to know.
Naam, Abu Hurairah was so much concerned about his mother. And his mother used to say bad things about the Prophet ﷺ. She was a disbeliever. So the Prophet ﷺ, saw him that he was concerned and so on. And actually, there are many instances with Abu Hurairah, by the way. But this one particular one, I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. But he said that to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ that he would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the guidance of his mother. His mother was an enemy to the deen of Islam. She took the Prophet ﷺ as an enemy, saying bad things about him, not neutral or anything. So the Prophet ﷺ, he made a direct dua, Allahumma hadi Abu Hurairah, which means, oh Allah, guide the mother of Abu Hurairah. The Abu Hurairah, once he heard this from the Prophet ﷺ, he knew that this is done, because the dua of the Prophet ﷺ is accepted. He was so happy, and he went home straight. And he heard that the sound of water, and his mother told him, wait, do not enter. And she was taking ghusl, or a shower, and she came out and she took the ghusl of Islam, and she said to him, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. So he was extremely happy, radiallahu anhu, and he took that opportunity that he went back to the Prophet ﷺ, and he asked more. And he said to the Prophet ﷺ that, something for himself. And the Prophet ﷺ made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that one of the signs of al-Iman for people to love Abu Hurairah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him beloved to the believers. And that's why a sign of al-Iman if people love Abu Hurairah. And a sign of hypocrisy if people hate Abu Hurairah. It's become a criteria.
It's related, Shaykh Ibrahim, to the point that we talked about the protection of the Sunnah. When some people they attack the Sunnah, they attack Abu Hurairah because he narrated lots of the hadith. So attacking him is a sign that he's not a pure Muslim.
They are hypocrites. It's hypocrisy, clearly. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ, he said. And in general, he said, alamatul iman hubbul ansar. That from the sign of al-Iman is to love al-Ansar. And alamatul nifaq, the sign of hypocrisy, is to hate al-Ansar. So in general and specific for Abu Hurairah.
SubhanAllah. The Prophet Muhammad, he used to pray for the guidance, not only for individuals, but also sometimes for tribes. And sometimes, like one of the companions, he's the only one who believes in Allah and His Messenger. And Prophet Muhammad raises his hand and prays for the whole tribe, and they come. So what can we learn from this? Because some people, when they know that maybe one tribe or one country, they don't accept the message of Islam, so okay, we curse them, we pray that Allah will punish them. So what lesson can we learn from that?
The Prophet ﷺ was sent as a mercy to mankind. And the Prophet ﷺ understood clearly that guidance is in the hands of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made it very clear that the guidance is not in the hands of anyone, even His beloved Prophet ﷺ. So the dua from the Prophet ﷺ for the guidance of specific individuals like Umar radiallahu anhu, like tribes and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted it. But in other situations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted the dua of the Prophet ﷺ when he did not guide, for example, his uncle when he asked for it, of course. But this was not fulfilled by the acceptance. Acceptance is not necessarily that exactly what a person asks for comes or happens, because this is a great wisdom behind it, and that is guidance is in the hands of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it clear to the Prophet إنك لا تهدي من أحببت ولكن الله يهدي من يشاء. You do not guide those who you love. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides whoever He wills. So this is something that is to show clearly that everything is in the control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, specifically with matters of guidance. So people should ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for guidance of others. They take the means. The result is not in our control, in our hand. And once a person sincerely makes the dua is accepted. And the acceptance of the dua, as the Prophet ﷺ said, it's one of three things. Either the person gets what he asked for, or an equal evil get pushed away from him, or that the reward of it and the person to see the effect of it will be seen in the hereafter. So therefore the acceptance is one thing, and what a person sees is all by the mercy of Allah and the wisdom of Allah. But with matters of the hereafter, of course, when a person asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Jannah, to be protected from the fire, this is definitely a very well-known goodness that a person would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for.
SubhanAllah, very beautiful, Sheikh Ibrahim. We're going to take a short break and come back, inshallah, to continue these beautiful insights. So, dear brothers and sisters, we're going to meet after the break, so stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum. Rasulallah, 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 Rasulallah. Welcome back, dear brothers and sisters. We're talking about the acceptance of the prayer of the Prophet ﷺ. And Sheikh Ibrahim, we were talking about like when Prophet Muhammad ﷺ prays for people for the guidance. There was an incident that somebody, the Prophet told him, like, what can I do for you, like a favor or something like that. So he asked him to be, like, to pray to Allah that he becomes with him in the Firdaus or in the paradise. But the Prophet didn't just directly pray for him, he said something. What can we learn from that?
This is Rabi' ibn Ka'b al-Islami radiallahu anhu. When he came to the Prophet, he used to come with the wudu of the Prophet, the water for the Prophet to make wudu. So the Prophet one time he said to him, ask me. And that's a very beautiful statement. This is an open statement from the Prophet. Whatever, anything that companion would ask for, he would be granted. And it shows the hearts of these companions radiallahu anhum. And the only thing that he said is, أسألك مرافقتك في الجنة. I ask you to be your companion with close to you in Jannah. So the Prophet ﷺ did not just take it and that's it. He said, أو غير ذلك, anything else? Okay, you got that. As if, anything else? A person might think, yes, I want all kinds of good things in this life. And that's why we need to test our hearts. If someone is given that in his lifetime, that ask. When the hearts are attached to the hereafter, we put this life in the right perspective. And that's why the dua of the Prophet ﷺ was accordingly, and the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, when the companion said that to him, and it shows the purity of his heart, the heart of this companion عنه, still the Prophet ﷺ said to him, أعني على نفسك بكثرة السجود. Help me to achieve this when you would yourself to do a lot of sujood. So this is the means to enter Jannah, is to make a lot of salah. A lot of sujood meaning a lot of salah, optional salah, to elevate him to this level. And this is the Prophet ﷺ, when it comes to matters of the hereafter and guidance, as we said, guidance is in the hands of Allah. There's no favor of anyone for anything whatsoever. So to help to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with that the guidance for the person to be guided to do the good deeds, to be obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. Can the Prophet ﷺ make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a disbeliever to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's against the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing happened when the Prophet ﷺ went to the grave of his mother and so on. Something that hurts every believer, but this is the reality of what the Prophet ﷺ himself said. So this companion, the Prophet ﷺ guided him if he wants his dua to be achieved. And the same thing when the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about the 70,000, those who would enter Jannah without reckoning. So Ukash ibn Mihsan radiallahu anhu, one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for me, that I'm one of them. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Anta minhum, you are one of them. Then another man stood up and he said, O Prophet of Allah, make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm one of them. The Prophet ﷺ said to him, Sabaqaka bi Ukash. Ukash has surpassed you in this. And that's a very nice and well-mannered statement by the Prophet ﷺ. He did not tell him no. And as the ulama, they say, whether the Prophet ﷺ knew that this man is not going to be among the 70,000, so he did want to say to him, no, but rather we'd say, Ukasha surpassed you with it. Or this man was a hypocrite.
Subhanallah.
You know, and the Prophet ﷺ, knew that he's not going to be among them, and he said such a thing. But the point here is that how the Prophet ﷺ, his dua was with the best manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not to transgress the limits. And that's why there's the dua, there's transgression in matters of dua. Like one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, when he entered on his son, and his son was making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, very, very specific dua. Allah, give me this thing in Jannah on the right side of this Jannah, like very specific things in Jannah. So the companion said to his son that the Prophet ﷺ forbade us from al-i'tida' fi dua, not to transgress in the dua. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make you enter Jannah. If you enter Jannah, you'll get everything in it. And that's why even sometimes, in the Salat al-Qiyam and so on, they make a long dua for the Qunut dua, and so many different things, and they make sure that the rhyme is there and so on. That this is not the way the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ was precise, concise words, and is very comprehensive. And that's why we need to follow the way the Prophet ﷺ.
And even maybe in the last previous episode we talked about how short and precise and concise the dua or the prayers of the Prophet ﷺ. Even this, and one of the companions came to the Prophet and he said, like, I cannot deal with how to say like what you're saying, and also Mu'adh, may Allah have pleasure on him. So he told him, like, you ask Allah for forgiveness and Jannah, and that's it. Right. So we can learn from that. Yeah.
Right. This is a very clear example of how the dua of the Prophet, if a person asks, what was the dua of the Prophet? We have books, of course, and narrations about the dua of the Prophet. Very beautiful to learn them and to read them and to see the concern. What is the concern of the Prophet ﷺ? That he would make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that concern to be fulfilled. Matters of the hereafter. Even putting things in the right perspective. Like for example, Allahumma inni as'aluka al-huda wal-tuqa wal-afafa wal-ghina.
SubhanAllah.
Right? Where the Prophet ﷺ would say, oh Allah, I ask you for al-huda, guidance, and tuqa, taqwa, to fear Allah, to be dutiful to Allah, wal-afaf, to be chaste and away from haram and so on, wal-ghina, and to be rich. See how he started with what's important, which is guidance. And the last thing is that everybody usually start with it first, that they want to be rich. This, it's still valid, but it comes after all of this. If there's no guidance, richness will be a source of misery for the person in this life and hereafter. If there's no fear of Allah, what's richness going to benefit the person? And so on. So we learn even from the way of the Prophet ﷺ that he gives the dua to give the priority for things in our life, to put forward matters of deen. When the Prophet ﷺ would say a farewell for someone that is traveling, for example, he would say the dua for when he would say for someone traveling, he said, "Astawdi'u Allah dinak wa amanataك wa khawatim a'malak. Zawadak Allah taqwa wa ghafara dhanbak wa yassar lak al-khayru haythu kan." That he would say, may Allah increase give you provisions of taqwa in your travel, and forgive your sin and make it easy for you wherever you go. When you're traveling, you're concerned more about to make it easy in my traveling. But the Prophet ﷺ put first the fear of Allah, forgiveness of the sins, and which is also important, but if the first two are not secured, what's benefit that a person would get if the travel is made easy, but in the sinful acts and not being forgiven and so on and so forth. So this example also with the companion, he heard the Prophet ﷺ making dua. So the Prophet ﷺ actually asked him, what do you say in your dua? He said, إِنِّي لَا أُحْسِنُ دَنْدَنَتَكَ وَدَنْدَنَتْ مُعَاذ. I'm not really good in your eloquency of speech or dua like you or yourself and Mu'adh radiallahu anhu. I don't say many things. I only say, Allah, Allahumma as'aluka al-jannah wa a'udhu bika min an-nar. Oh Allah, I ask you for Jannah and I seek refuge in you from the hellfire. The Prophet ﷺ told him, حَوْلَهَا نُدَنْدِنْ أَنَا وَمُعَاذ. Around the same meaning, me and Mu'adh are saying the same thing.
SubhanAllah.
And that's why, say for example, someone says, Allahumma as'aluka al-jannah. What does that mean? Oh Allah, make me enter Jannah. Does it mean that his life will be a miserable life?
No.
No, if you enter Jannah, that means he is among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose. That's why رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنًا وفي الآخرة حَسَنًا وقنا عذاب النار. Something that the Prophet ﷺ would frequently say. Oh Allah, give us the best of this life and the best hasana in the hereafter and shield us from the hellfire. Anas radiallahu anhu, one time someone came with the son ask Anas, their president, to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them. So Anas radiallahu anhu, he said this only. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. So as if the man belittled it. So that's it. He's coming. You think that he's going to have some eloquent dua and long dua. Anas radiallahu anhu, when he felt this from him, he said, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيا حَسَنَةً. Allah, give us hasana in this world, means a good house, a good ride, a good wife, a good children. All of this comes under this one word. And al-akhirah hasana, to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to receive all of the types of delights, and to be shielded and protected from the hellfire. What else that a person wants? And this is basically the way and the dua of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet ﷺ. And he would even say to the companions what is going to happen to them, and making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them, whether it's materialistic matters or matters of the hereafter. Or someone would ask the Prophet ﷺ that he's a martyr, and he makes dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this person becomes a martyr, and so on.
SubhanAllah, very beautiful. We would like Shaykh also to focus on that the Prophet ﷺ and other messengers, they asked Allah for things and they were accepted, but they took time to be applied or for something to happen. Like Prophet Musa, I think some of the tafsir or interpretation of the Quran says that the destruction of Pharaoh took 40 years or something like this after the acceptance of prayer. So how can we learn from this, from the acceptance of the prayer, even from the best to the best, that it's not a must that it has to happen in the moment?
See, one of the manners and adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that a person makes dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he sincerely seek the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the acceptance is something that is not necessarily going to be according to what the person wants, because we're so limited. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most wise.
SubhanAllah.
And that's exactly what you mentioned about the dua of Musa alayhi salam. The delay of the acceptance, or the delay of the outcome, to be precise, of what a person asked for, has great benefits that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. Extracting certain acts of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that can never be achieved unless they were weak and oppressed. That it won't be there when they are victorious, and so on. Or the ways of Allah necessitates for them to be or to endure more patience. Like say for example someone, they might say nowadays, we keep on making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change the situations of the Muslims, and nothing happens. A person would say the situation is even getting worse. This can be looked in from two different situations. First of all, the dua, a person should never give up on the dua. And the dua is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from those who are sincere. And the acceptance of the dua doesn't have to happen immediately. But once a dua of one person is accepted, then the means for it can be then well established for it to happen. And there is so much great wisdom behind the delay of the victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is the good aspect of it. And that's why still the believer should ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help, but for them to be patient, for them to sacrifice for the sake of Allah. Where that going to be? When things are at ease and established and so on. So that's the same thing with the Prophet ﷺ, with the prophets of Allah. And some things even that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be precise also, did not grant the Prophet ﷺ when it comes to the dua for his ummah, that the Prophet ﷺ asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they are not destroyed all of them as a punishment, like the punishment to the nations before. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted that. Not all of them to be punished with drowning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept that. But then the third one, the Prophet ﷺ, when he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَلَا يَجْعَلْ بَأْسَهُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not make enmity among one another. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not accept this one.
They have to handle it, they have to do it in the right way.
That means this will happen, that there will be enmity among them. Not the entire ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, but they won't be safe from this. So they have to protect themselves from falling into this trap of enmity and so on. And the Prophet ﷺ was pleased with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him and gave him.
SubhanAllah. Jazakallah Shaykh Ibrahim. Time flies as usual. Thank you so much. And thank you, dear brothers and sisters. Until next time in Signs of Prophethood, stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.